My name's Dirk Velton, and these two slightly shifty-looking characters are me and my dad years ago. His name is Hubert Heinrich Velton, though folks called him Bert. And he was born in Germany, but he wanted to see the world and began to do so by immigrating to the United States in 1950 with my mom, who I'm delighted to say is here today. She's front and center with my wife, Jane. So after they immigrated, my sister Karen was born in Chicago shortly after that, and I showed up in 1953. Because of my dad and because of those desires that he had, we got to spend summers in Germany visiting family, speaking two languages. We got to travel a lot, including living in Brazil for 4 years, starting when I was 11. And he eventually did get to see the world. He served for many years as Director of Industrial Engineering for IT&T, so his passport was had more visas stamped in it than you could practically count. And sadly, he died in 1980. He was only 60, and I was 27 at the time. But in terms of what he passed on to me, it seems to me that there were two kinds of gifts. And one kind was these teaching moments, things that he felt that I needed to know and that he passed on as father to son. And they could be anything from how to respect women and treat them well to how to repair a lamp, which I can recall in every little detail. And those moments and a lot like them are really some of the sweetest memories that I have growing up. But I think the most powerful gifts that I got from my dad were the ones that simply got imprinted on me from being around him. And it wasn't even until years later that I recognized what some of those were. And at the top of that list, I would say, is the way he connected with all kinds of folks, especially across differences of class and skin color and ethnicity. And for him, that was just second nature. When I was 5 years old, we moved into our first house outside of Chicago, where my dad worked for a manufacturing company. And he occasionally worked through the night, and he liked to re-engineer the equipment to make it work better. And he'd be there all night. And during those late night shifts, he got to know a man on the custodial staff named Joe, who was African American. And when my dad decided to build a rock garden in the backyard, which was basically cutting out an entire long hillside and putting up a wall where my mom would plant flowers between the rocks, he hired Joe to work with him to do that. And at 5, I thought what they were doing was amazing, and I was all over it. I tried to be involved as much as I could. But when I look back at those 4 or 5 days, what I see is this bond that grew between my dad and Joe, and it's the kind of bond that comes when men work together and sweat together and they accomplish things, and then they sit back and have a beer and they admire their handiwork. And I could sense that affection, that there's a particular kind of male intimacy, I think, that comes from that. And years later, when we were living in Brazil, my dad had good friendships with both the white American corporate colleagues that he had and the local folks that he worked with. But his closest friend was a guy named Jose Marcos. And there, too, I would hang around with the two of them, and I could feel this sense of real connection. And I would watch them as they had these long, quiet conversations late into the night. My last memory of my dad before he died it's right along the same thread. And what happened was that he was in a good deal of pain from what turned out to be an aneurysm near his heart. And my mom and I had taken him to emergency at a hospital in Manhattan. And the memory is that I look and I can still see him through a doorway at the end of a hall, and he was sitting on an exam table in his hospital gown, and he was speaking with the black woman who had taken his x-rays and now was helping him prep for surgery. And I'm watching them, and they were talking and swapping stories and laughing out loud and joking like old friends who hadn't seen each other in too long. And I just kind of shook my head because it was so typical. And so, losing him unexpectedly that day was terribly, terribly sad. But the gift is, there's this perfect image of him, and there's a lot of sweetness in it, even in the sadness. But there's this perfect image of him that reminds me that how he lived his life helped me become the man that I am today. So consider myself enormously lucky that he was my dad. I'm glad to say that his and my relationship has continued to improve over the years. And I'm very grateful for a chance to honor him and also to say thanks to my mom.